There is a moment in every woman's life when she realizes that the people she trusted the most were building a cage around her and calling it love. For me, that moment came on the most beautiful day of my life. The day I wore white. The day I smiled for photographs I would later never be able to look at again. The day my father, the man who taught me to walk, who dried my tears, who told me I was his entire world, looked me in the eye and said words so cold, so final, so devastating, that they broke something inside me I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. Back to the girl I was before all of this. Back to the daughter who believed with every fiber of her heart that her father's love was unconditional. My name is Serena. And until I was 28 years old, I lived a life that most people would have called perfect. My father, Richard Calloway, was not just a wealthy man. He was a powerful man. The kind of powerful that makes other powerful people nervous. He had built his real estate empire from almost nothing, $200 in his pocket, a secondhand suit, and what he always called a talent for seeing value where others saw rubble. By the time I was born, he was already a millionaire. By the time I turned 10, he was a CEO. By the time I graduated college, his name was on 3 skyscrapers in the city, and his face had been on the cover of business magazines more times than I could count. Growing up as Richard Calloway's daughter was complicated. On one hand, I had everything. A beautiful home, the best schools, clothes that cost more than most people's rent, vacations in places I had to look up on a map. On the other hand, I had a father who was always somewhere else. Board meetings, business trips, client dinners, conference calls at midnight. Even when he was physically present, there was a part of him that felt unreachable. Like he was always standing behind glass. My mother left when I was 7. She and my father had a marriage that, from what I can piece together now, was less a partnership and more a business arrangement that stopped being convenient. She moved to Europe with a man she had met at one of my father's charity galas. I saw her 3 times after that. She sent birthday cards with neat, looping handwriting and signed them with love. But it was the kind of love that didn't require presents. So it was just my father and me. And despite everything, despite the distance, despite the coldness, despite the way he sometimes looked at me like he was calculating my worth instead of simply loving me, I adored him. I believed in him. I had constructed an entire identity around being Richard Calloway's daughter, and I wore that identity like armor. I worked at his company. Of course I did. After college, there was never really a question of what I would do. My father sat me down the week after graduation, slid a contract across the table, just like he would with any new hire, and said, "You start Monday." I signed it without reading it. That was the first of many mistakes. For 4 years, I worked harder than almost anyone in that building. Not because I had to. Not because my father demanded it. But because some part of me believed that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself thoroughly enough, he would finally see me. Not as Richard Calloway's daughter. Not as an extension of his legacy. But as Serena. Just Serena. I ran 3 major project divisions. I brought in 2 of the company's biggest clients. I stayed late. I came in early. I skipped holidays and weekend plans and personal milestones because work always came first. And my father? He said, "Good job," exactly twice in 4 years. I counted. The first time I met Daniel was at one of my father's company events, a rooftop dinner for investors on a warm July evening. I was standing near the railing, half listening to a conversation I had no interest in, holding a glass of sparkling water because I never drank at company events. When I turned around and nearly walked directly into him, he caught my arm to steady me, laughed, and said, "Careful. I've heard the view from the top is great, but the fall is terrible." I laughed. It was the most genuine laugh I had produced in months. Daniel was an architect. A brilliant one, self-made, quietly confident, with none of the performative arrogance that filled most rooms at events like that. He asked me questions and then actually listened to the answers. He made me feel, within 30 minutes of meeting him, like someone worth talking to. We exchanged numbers that night. He texted me exactly 1 week later, not 2 days, not immediately, not the next morning. 1 week, like he had thought about it. Like it mattered. We were together within 3 months. Engaged within 2 years. My father did not like Daniel. He was careful about it in the beginning. My father was always careful. He did not say, I don't like this man. He said things like, he seems comfortable with where he is, which in my father's language meant, he is not ambitious enough. He said, what exactly are his long-term plans? He said, I just want to make sure you're protected, Serena. I translated all of it incorrectly. I heard concern. I heard love. I heard a father who wanted what was best for his daughter. What I didn't hear, what I refused to hear, was control, because my father had opinions about everything in my life. My apartment, too far from the office. My friends, the wrong kind of connections. My clothing choices for important meetings. The way I spent my days off. He had spent so many years shaping me, directing me, that when I finally found someone that was entirely mine, that he had no hand in creating, he didn't know what to do with it, and what my father didn't know what to do with. He tried to dismantle. The engagement announcement dinner was tense. My father sat at the head of the table as he always did, and spent most of the meal asking Daniel pointed questions disguised as polite conversation. What projects was he working on? What was his 5-year plan? Whether he had considered expanding into commercial development. Daniel answered everything calmly, warmly, without flinching. I loved him for that. Later that night, after Daniel had gone home, my father called me into his study, the dark paneled room that had always felt more like a courtroom than a sanctuary, and said, very quietly, you know, you don't have to do this. I told him I wanted to. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once and said, but I hope you know what you're choosing. I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. Asterisk the 18 months of wedding planning were a steady intention I kept pretending I couldn't see. My father paid for the wedding, of course he did, everything had to be his, and used that payment as a kind of invisible leash. Every vendor, every venue decision, every detail of the guest list went through him. He added 200 people I had never met. He moved our ceremony location from the intimate garden Daniel and I had chosen to a ballroom that held 500. He hired a wedding planner whose allegiance, I would later realize, was to him and not to me. Daniel asked me several times whether we might consider paying for the wedding ourselves. Doing something smaller. Something that actually felt like us. I said no. Because saying yes would have felt like a betrayal of my father, and I was not ready for that. Looking back, I understand that I was not protecting my father's feelings. I was protecting my fear. My fear of what happened if I finally said no to the man who had given me everything. My fear of the love being taken away. I didn't realize then that it had conditions all along. The week before the wedding, my father called me into that same study. Same dark panels. Same leather chair behind the same massive desk. Same quiet, deliberate way he had of making you feel small without ever raising his voice. Asterisk, he slid a document across the desk. Thick, formal, bound. Asterisk, what is this? I asked. A prenuptial agreement, he said. For Daniel to sign. I stared at it. Dad, we already discussed this. Daniel agreed to a prenup months ago. We had our lawyers handle. This is a different prenup, my father said. I opened it. I read the first 3 pages slowly, carefully, the way he'd always taught me to read contracts. And what I found there made my hands go completely still. It was not a prenuptial agreement. Not really. It was a document that would give my father controlling interest in the shares of the company. He had transferred to my name over the years shares that represented nearly a third of my net worth in the event of my marriage to someone he had not approved. It was a financial trap dressed in legal language. If Daniel signed it, we would be fine. If Daniel refused to sign it, which any reasonable person would, I would lose the shares regardless. Because the triggering clause was simply marriage. My father had spent a year preparing this. While I was planning flowers and choosing place settings, he was planning this. I looked up at him. He looked back at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not guilt. Something far worse than either. Certainty. Complete, calm certainty that he was right. You have until Friday, he said. The wedding is Saturday. I picked up the document and walked out of his office without saying a single word. That was the last normal conversation I had with my father before my wedding day. I did not tell Daniel about the document. Not that night. Not the next day. Not the day after that. I told myself I was protecting him. That the stress of the wedding was already enough. That I could handle this. That I would find a way to talk to my father, to make him understand, to appeal to whatever fragment of parental love I still believe existed inside him. I called him twice. He didn't answer. I texted him. He read the messages without replying. Thursday night, the night before the wedding, I drove to his house. Stood on the doorstep of the home I had grown up in a coat over my pajamas, hair unwashed, and rang the bell. His assistant answered. His actual assistant. At 10 o'clock at night at his private residence, she told me, with practiced composure, that Mr. Calloway was unavailable. I drove home in a kind of silent shock. Sat in my car outside my apartment for 20 minutes, cried, wiped my face. Went inside. And made a decision. I was getting married tomorrow. And my father was going to have to live with his choices, just as I was going to have to live with mine. My wedding day was beautiful. I will say that and mean it, because it was, despite everything, it was genuinely, breathtakingly beautiful. The flowers were perfect. The light was perfect. My dress, which I had chosen myself in a small boutique with no input from anyone, felt like it had been made for me. Daniel cried when he saw me walk down the aisle. Not quietly. He actually had to press his lips together and look up at the ceiling and still couldn't stop the tears from falling. And when he finally looked back at me, the expression on his face was the most purely loving thing I have ever seen in my entire life. My father walked me down the aisle. He did it correctly, arm through mine, steps measured, face composed. He shook Daniel's hand at the altar. He kissed my cheek. He never smiled, not once. In any of the photographs. In any of the moments that were supposed to be the ones I would carry with me forever. He sat in the front row during the ceremony with the careful stillness of a man waiting for a meeting to end. He ate at the reception. He made conversation. He gave a toast, a short one, carefully worded, that said absolutely nothing of substance about me or Daniel or love or family. He thanked the guests for coming. He raised his glass. And then 2 hours into the reception, before the cake cutting, before the last dance, before any of the moments that should have been witnessed by a father, he left. No goodbye to me. No goodbye to Daniel. He simply stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. I saw him go. I was on the dance floor. I watched his broad back move through the crowd and disappear through the door, and I kept dancing. Kept smiling. Kept my arms around my husband's neck, because if I had stopped, I would have fallen apart. And I was not going to let him take that from me too. The call came on Monday morning. We were still on our honeymoon, barely 48 hours in. Sitting on a balcony in a beautiful hotel in Portugal with coffee and pastries and the most ordinary, perfect happiness I had ever experienced. When my phone rang, it was my father's lawyer. He informed me, in the measured, neutral tone of a man who delivers bad news for a living, that effective immediately I had been removed from my position at Calloway and Associates. My access to company systems had been revoked. The shares my father had transferred to me over the years, the ones referenced in that document he had tried to make Daniel sign, had been legally reclaimed, under a clause in the original transfer agreement that my father had apparently included 4 years ago. Buried in language I had never thought to look for, the house I lived in, which I had believed was mine, technically still in a family trust that my father controlled. My company car, my expense accounts, my everything. Gone. I sat very still on that balcony with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the lawyer speak, watching the ocean in the distance. The coffee went cold. The pastry sat untouched. Daniel came out from the room, took one look at my face, and sat down next to me. When the call ended, I set the phone on the table, looked at my husband, and said very quietly, my father just cut me off from everything. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over, took my hand, and said, okay, tell me everything. And then we figure out what comes next. That was when I understood what I had married. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. We cut our honeymoon short by 4 days, not because Daniel wanted to, but because I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't sit on a beautiful balcony eating pastries while my entire life was being dismantled. Back home. We came back to find that my apartment building had received notice from the family trust that the unit needed to be vacated within 30 days. 30 days. I had lived there for 4 years. My books were on those shelves. My plants were on those windowsills. I had painted one wall in the living room a dusty rose because it made me happy every time I saw it dot 30 days. I had some personal savings, not nothing, but not enough. Nowhere near enough for the life I had been living. I had been drawing a salary from the company, spending it on the assumption that my financial foundation was solid because my father had told me it was. I had trusted him. I had trusted him completely. I tried to reach him. Of course I tried. I called, I emailed. I sent a letter, an actual physical letter, because I thought perhaps the formality of it would reach something in him. My calls went to voicemail and were never returned. My emails received automated out-of-office responses. The letter I found out months later from a former colleague was opened by his assistant, who flagged it as personal correspondence and placed it in a file. He never read it. The people I thought were my friends, the ones I had known through the company, through my father's social circle, through years of shared events and dinners and professional courtesies, almost all of them disappeared. It was not dramatic. There were no confrontations, no explicit loyalties declared. They simply stopped responding, stopped including me. The invitations that used to arrive without thoughts stopped arriving at all. I learned what I should have understood a long time ago, that those connections had never been about me. They had been about proximity to my father, to his name, to his power. When the name lost its power, or rather, when I was separated from it, I became invisible. There were two people who stayed. My college roommate, Priya, who had never once been impressed by my father's wealth and had always looked at me like I was simply Serena. Her friend, the one who stress-ate cheese crackers during exam season and cried at nature documentaries. And my colleague Marcus, who had worked alongside me for 3 years and who showed up at my door 2 weeks after the honeymoon with a bottle of wine and said, "I heard what happened. That was wrong. How can I help?" 2 people. Out of a life that had appeared from the outside to be full, there is a specific kind of grief that comes not from losing a person, but from losing who you believe that person to be. My father was not dead. He was alive and running his empire and attending his galas and conducting his board meetings. I could have looked him up on LinkedIn and seen his smiling professional photograph any day of the week. He existed, but the father I had believed in, the man I had built my entire identity around, whose approval I had chased like a horizon my whole adult life, that man, I was slowly realizing had never existed. He had been a story I told myself, a fiction I needed because the truth was too painful. The truth was that my father had always seen me as an extension of his legacy, not a person of my own. That his love had always been transactional, contingent, conditional. That the price of being Richard Calloway's daughter was being Richard Calloway's property. And when I had finally chosen something for myself, a man he had not selected, a life he had not designed, he had collected what he considered his debt. Daniel never once complained. That is the thing I want you to understand about him, because it would have been so easy for him to say, even gently, "I told you so," even just a look, even a sigh. He never did. He picked up extra projects. We found a smaller apartment together, our first real home, chosen entirely by us with no strings attached to anyone's trust fund. It had creaky floors and a radiator that made noise all winter and a kitchen so small we had to take turns. I loved it more than anywhere I had ever lived. He made dinner. He let me cry on the nights when the grief came heavy. He held space for my anger without letting it poison us. He reminded me in the quiet and the steady way he had of doing everything, that I was more than what I had lost. There were nights when I lay awake in that small apartment and felt the full, raw weight of what had happened. Not just the money, not just the job, but the loss of the version of my father I had needed to believe in. The loss of the childhood that made sense only if he had loved me the way I thought he did. I went to therapy twice a week, because once wasn't enough. I sat in a quiet office with a woman named Dr. Reeves, who had warm eyes and a box of tissues on the side table, and who did not let me minimize what I was carrying. She said something to me in our 3rd session that I have thought about almost every day since. The fact that he is capable of this doesn't mean you were wrong to love him. It means you loved him anyway. That is not your failure. That is your humanity. 3 months after the wedding, I started applying for jobs. Properly this time, not as Richard Calloway's daughter, not on the strength of a name, but on the stir, 6 months after my wedding day, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I had gotten very good at not answering numbers I didn't recognize. Too many calls in the months prior had been lawyers, accountants, people connected to my father's machinery. I had learned to be careful, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was familiar. Older, thinner somehow, even through a phone speaker. But unmistakably familiar. Serena, my father. I sat down. Slowly, carefully, the way you sit when you're not sure if the ground beneath you is stable. Dad. A long pause. Long enough that I checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Then, I need to tell you some things. He had been sick. That was the first thing he told me. Not as an opening bid for sympathy, or perhaps it was, I was no longer certain I could read him accurately, but as context. As the beginning of a longer explanation, a cardiac event. 3 months ago. Serious enough to require surgery. Serious enough that for a period of 48 hours, his prognosis had been genuinely uncertain. He had not told me. He had not called. He had not reached out through any of the channels I had left open. However, cautiously, his assistant had apparently sent a brief message to my old work email, the one I no longer had access to. I absorbed this information quietly. I did not know how to feel about it. I still don't entirely. The doctors, he said, told me that stress was a significant factor. That I needed to reconsider some things in my life. Another pause. I've been doing that. I waited. I know what I did was wrong, he said. The words came out carefully, like he was reading them off a page he had rehearsed. I know that taking those shares back, removing you from the company, I know that wasn't right. I told myself it was protecting the company. Protecting the legacy. But I understand that it was really about... He trailed off. Started again. It was about control. It was about being afraid of losing you to a life I couldn't manage. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said very carefully, you didn't lose me to a life you couldn't manage. Dad, you pushed me away from a life you wouldn't stop managing. Silence. Then, yes, that's correct. He wanted to restore the shares. His legal team was preparing the paperwork. He wanted me to consider coming back to the company, not in the same role. He understood that was not something I would want, but in a capacity that we could design together. He had spoken to the board. There was appetite for it. He also, and this was the part that surprised me most, said that he owed Daniel an apology. That he had treated him as a threat when he should have treated him as family. That he could see, in retrospect, what kind of man Daniel was. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I told him that Daniel would need to receive that apology directly, in his own time. If and when Daniel chose to doubt my father, said he understood. Here's what I want you to understand about what happened. Next, I did not forgive my father that day. I did not forgive him the next week or the week after. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, the kind that isn't just a performance for someone else's comfort, does not work on that kind of timeline. What I did was agree to continue the conversation. We started meeting monthly, then every few weeks. Always in neutral places, not his office, not the home I'd grown up in. Coffee shops, mostly. Sometimes a quiet restaurant. Always with the understanding that I could leave. That these meetings were not obligations. That I was choosing them, not being drawn back into a dynamic that had broken me. It was slow. It was uncomfortable. There were sessions where he said things that were still too controlling, still too transactional, and I said so. And he had to sit with that. But there was also, for the first time in my memory, a version of my father who was trying. Genuinely trying. Not performing concern while pursuing an agenda. Actually trying. Whether that trying would eventually become something I could trust, I still didn't know, but it was a beginning. And I had learned by then not to mistake beginnings for endings. I did not take the shares back immediately. I waited 4 months. Had my own lawyer when I had found myself, paid myself, owed nothing to my father's network, review every document. Made sure there were no hidden clauses this time. No buried conditions. No traps dressed as gifts, when everything was clean, when the documents were exactly what they said they were and nothing else. I signed them not because I needed the money. Not because I was forgiving the past, because they were mine. I had earned them through 4 years of real work. They were not charity and they were not leverage. They were a correction of something that should never have been taken in the first place. As for the company, I stayed where I was. The mid-sized firm where no one knew my father's name, where I had to earn every single thing on my own merit. 6 months after joining, I was promoted. Real promotion with a real title and a real conversation about why. My director told me, "You are one of the most focused people I have ever worked with. You work like you have something to prove, but not in a way that is about ego. It is about actual quality. About actually caring whether the work is right." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I think what he was seeing was the product of losing everything and then rebuilding, that specific kind of clarity that comes when you are forced to understand, at the bone level, that you are not your name, not your father's legacy, not the trappings of a life you were handed. You are what you do when those things are gone. Daniel and Erhe. I moved into a new apartment, a little bigger, a little lighter, chosen together from a list we made ourselves, with no input from anyone who was not us. We painted the living room a warm amber that Daniel said looked like late afternoon light. He was right. It did doubt we have dinner together most nights. We argue about small things, who forgot to buy coffee, which route is faster on a Tuesday, whether the plant in the corner needs more water. We take walks on Sunday mornings. We have started talking about what the next few years might look like. It is the most ordinary life I have ever had, and it is, without question, the richest. I think about the version of myself who stood in her father's study, hands going still over that document, not understanding yet what it meant. I want to sit with her for a moment. Take her hands. Tell her, what is about to happen is going to break you open in ways you cannot imagine from where you are standing. You are going to lose things you thought were permanent. You are going to find out that some of the people you trusted most were only with you because of what you could give them. You are going to spend nights on a creaky floor crying in a way you never allowed yourself to cry. When you had the beautiful apartment and the important job title and the father whose name opened every door. And then you are going to build something real. Not because you're extraordinary, not because you're special, but because when you're stripped of everything that was given to you, you discover what was always yours. And you realize slowly, painfully, with the kind of stubborn hope that only grows in difficult soil, that what is truly yours is enough. More than enough. I do not know what the next chapter with my father looks like. I am learning to stop trying to write it in advance, to stop rehearsing conversations, anticipating outcomes, protecting myself so far ahead that I can't be present for what is actually happening. I know that I love him. I think I will always love him. Love, I have learned, is not the same thing as trust, and trust is not the same thing as safety. And safety is something I have to build for myself from the inside out, not the outside in. I know that he is trying. I know that illness and time have done something to him that nothing else could. I know that the man who sat across from me at a small coffee shop 3 months ago, with less certainty and more humility than I had ever seen in him, was not performing. I know that rebuilding is possible. I also know it is not required. I get to choose. That is, I think, the most important thing I've learned through all of this. I get to choose what to take back and what to leave behind, who I let in and how far, what my relationship with my father becomes, if anything. And on his terms. I spent 28 years believing that love required me to surrender my choices to someone else's design. I know better now. If you are somewhere in the middle of a story like this, if you are the daughter who is still trying to earn something that should never have had a price tag, or the woman who just discovered that the floor beneath her was built on conditions she never agreed to, I want to say this to you. You're allowed to grieve the parent you needed and didn't have. You are allowed to be furious. You are allowed to mourn the childhood that makes more sense as loss than as love. And you are also, I promise you, even when you cannot feel it, allowed to be okay. Not because everything gets resolved. Not because the people who hurt you will change. Not because justice always shows up on schedule, but because you are not only your pain. You are also the person who kept going when keeping going was the hardest thing imaginable. You are the person who, when everything was taken, found out what was left, and what was left was you, and you are enough.